welcome everybody. We're just about ready to get started here. And I would just like to say a couple of things on behalf of the Hyde Park Historical Society and the Chicago Hyde Park Village, who are co-sponsors of this book club. Welcome all. I'm going to just give a brief ad for a couple of our upcoming meetings. Our October 17th meeting, Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Path to Peace. Christopher Blattman, professor at the University of Chicago. And then a very special meeting in November, which is our very own Jeff Deutsch, who is the director of the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, who has written a book in praise of good bookstores, and he will be coming off his European tour to join us in November. So those are the two things that are coming up. But now I'm going to turn this over to Dottie, who is going to introduce Bill and talk about our book tonight.
Greetings, and we're pleased to have Bill Savage here as a discussant this evening. He's the author of the foreword to the republication of the book Time for Frankie Coolin. Bill is a professor of American literature at Northwestern University, and his research and teaching focuses on several areas in the 20th and 21st centuries. Bill also teaches seminars and courses at the Newberry Library. And speaking of Nelson Algren, this past summer, he taught a course titled Reading Chicago Classics, The Man with the Golden Arm. He is also a noted contributor to the Chicago Reader. Bill's most recent book-long project is an introduction to and annotation of George Ade's 1931 book, The Old Time Saloon, Not Wet, Not Dry, Just History, published by the University of Chicago Press. And just a note, the first edition of Time for Frankie Coolin was published in 1982 and eventually went out of print. And then the University of Chicago Press reissued it. And Bill is a lifelong resident of Rogers Park. Thanks, Bill.
Don't hold that against me. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking the Hyde Park Historical Society Book Club and especially maybe Dottie for inviting me to do this. I have one quick favor to ask. If we could, Zoom, if we could refrain from using the chat during, because every time that happens, it pops up and it kind of derails me just a little bit. Saving chat questions for the end is great. And yes, happy to be part of the Bruseum National Advisory Board as well. Thank you all for showing up. It's a beautiful night out. You could be sitting out at Promontory Point or over at Jimmy's. Instead, you're here, and I hope to make it worth your while. My plan, and I've learned long ago that whenever you do public speaking like this, it's best to let everyone know what the plan is, so no one's wondering. I want us to have a discussion about what I really think is one of the most neglected great books in Chicago's literary tradition, Time for Frankie Coolin by Bill Granger. I'm aware, or I've been advised, that maybe not everybody's read the whole book, which is fine. This is not going to affect your final grade or your GPA. So I will maybe attempt to not give any spoilers regarding the end of the book as we discuss things. I'm going to lead up to that part of our conversation tonight by talking about Bill Granger as a Chicago writer, and more generally talking about Chicago literary traditions and why I make this, rather strong claim that this novel should be in the Chicago literary canon. And then Q&A discussion. And again, knowing that some of you read it and some of you haven't, it'll just be free form. We'll see how it goes. So first, in terms of talking about Chicago literature, I think it's really important to have a frame that is more than just books about Chicago or books by people from Chicago. I won't get into the whole background of how I've come to the frame I like to use, because that would be a 10-minute conversation and this meeting is too short. But basically, I work from a book by a Chinese American, I call him a geographer philosopher named Yi-Fu Tuan, who just recently passed away. But he had a book called Space and Place, The Perspective of Experience. And I was looking for ways to think about literature of place. Again, beyond just writers from a place or writers about a place. What do we mean when we say place? What do we mean when we say space? And in that book, Tuan gets into lots of different cultural constructions of our sense of place. Like, most cultures have a sense of sacred and profane space. We associate spaces with time with spaces, like the future is in front of us, except in some cultures where it's behind us because you can't see it because it hasn't happened yet. Really interesting book. And there's a line in it that when I was doing this reevaluation, jumped off the page and has become my mantra for talking about Chicago literature. And the line was, what begins as undifferentiated space becomes place as we get to know it better and endow it with values, or space plus values equals place. Space is abstract, place is particular. Bookstore, that could be the Amazon store up in Lakeview, or it can be the Seminary Co-op. Abstractly, they're the same thing. Concretely, in the particulars, they're very different because what matters in each space is very different. And that's how I interpret the term values. Values are what matters, what's important, what's at stake. So anytime I'm looking at a text about Chicago, I'm asking, what values does this writer endow the space with? Through how the characters act, through how the space is literally built. How does the writer understand the values that make a particular Chicago space a place rather than just a generalization? And Chicago, historically, the way I like to put it is, it was an unprecedented place. In 1833, when the village was incorporated at Wolf Point, there were about 300 people here. 60 years later, a human lifetime, there's 1 million people here in 1893 for the World's Columbian Exposition. No city in the history of the world had ever grown that fast. It was literally unimaginable. People could not get their heads around it. The physical environment was sprawling and filthy and full of crazy innovations like giant factories and skyscrapers and a river that would eventually flow uphill, and social arrangements that were not the Brahmins of Boston or the 400 of New York, settled old families. No, the socially prominent people in Chicago were brewers and butchers and hotel keepers. People who'd come here from somewhere else and made themselves into something new in that great American story. But this great place was in some ways thought to be beyond artistic representation. And here I'm working off my mentor, Carl Smith's book, Chicago and the American Literary Imagination. Because it wasn't Boston or New York, Henry James couldn't write about it, frankly, much less London. Henry James's head would have exploded trying to represent this place. It was thought to be inherently unpoetic, unartistic, because all people here cared about was making money, getting ahead. And there was no life of the mind and no genteel society. And there's two ways to handle that conundrum. One is to just shrug and say, yeah, can't do it, can't go there. The other is what groundbreaking writers like Theodore Dreiser and Carl Sandburg did, which was recreate literary methods in order to represent the values that make Chicago the place it is. Sandburg, with his Chicago poems, plain language poetry, write poetry in the same words that journalists use in the daily newspaper. And I would like to remind us all that when Poetry Magazine published some of the Chicago poems in 1914, people canceled their subscriptions. Mm-hmm. Because hog butcher for the world, that's not poetry. Poetry is flowers and true love and beauty and the lakefront with the sun shining on it in the morning. No, hog butcher for the world. Keep in mind, that's a job. Theodore Dreiser, about a decade earlier, or a decade and a half earlier, in his groundbreaking novel, Sister Carrie, just went one step further than other realist writers had gone and got to a place where you had realism without moralism. To represent him, to knock Henry James again, and no knock if anybody here is a big Henry James fan, but I'm not. His novel Daisy Miller, what happens to a young woman in the city, in this case Rome, where you are hanging out with Italian gentlemen of ill repute who you haven't been formally introduced to. Well, you get malaria and die, because that's what's supposed to happen, right? Good things are supposed to happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Your book might be very realistic about like how people dress and what the dinner are like and what the sort of social codes are. But there was an idea that you were supposed to represent in literature, not the world as it really was, but the world as it should be. Literature had a moral component. And Dreiser's like, no, it's not, no. Literature should just tell the truth, just like journalism does. And so in Sister Carrie, the young girl who goes astray doesn't end up jumping in the river or getting hit by a streetcar. She goes to New York and becomes a star on Broadway. The men who ruin her have their own fates work out. But there's no sense in this Chicago literature tradition in fiction that what you need to do is falsify things. And I think this book is especially good about certain aspects of race and identity for not the truth. So in fiction, the fictional traditions that come out of Dreiser, and again, Dreiser, Sandberg, all these guys, it's all part of one big messy thing. But we're mostly talking about a novel here, so I'm sticking with the fictional tradition. Time for Frankie Coolin is a direct descendant of Studs Lonergan by James T. Farrell, of Native Son by Richard Wright, The Man with the Golden Arm, and Never Come Morning by Nelson Algren. Farrell and Wright and Algren have all been described by literary critics who deal in this world as neighborhood novelists. They were writers who saw their job heavily influenced by sociology as developed at the University of Chicago, since we're going to nod at the U of C a lot today. To represent the real life, tell the truth about the neighborhoods that they lived in. So the Washington Park novels by Farrell, not just the Studs Lonergan trilogy, but the Danny O'Neill pentalogy, if you want to spend an entire summer reading 8 novels. Wright's Bronzeville, or the Black Belt, and also Hyde Park, Kenwood, and Nelson Algren's Wicker Park and Bucktown, then just known as the Near Northwest Side. Time for Frankie Coolin is the novel that depicts the white flight from the West Side to the Western suburbs, from the point of view of the white flighters or white fleeters, I'm not sure what I want to call them, as opposed to where we usually see such things, which I'll get to in a minute, the point of view from the African Americans wanting to get out of segregated housing. Other small things that I think put this book in the tradition and show very clearly how engaged with Chicago literature Granger was. And by the way, if you're ever just sort of looking around old used bookstores and stuff, the column he did in the Tribune in the early 80s to mid 80s, they gave him a column in the Sunday magazine and he did excerpts from classic Chicago fiction. So if you spot any of those in your, in boxes of old stuff you've got in your basement, they're well worth looking at. But Frankie's name, Frankie Coolin, recalls Frankie Machine from The Man with the Golden Arm. The racially charged, conflict and concord interactions between Frankie Coolin and Willie Obo and other Black characters in the book. This is from Native Son. That's got its roots there. But the most specific detail, and one that I mentioned in my introduction to this edition, is Frankie was a plasterer. And William Studs Lonergan was also a plasterer. And this is a really interesting decision because, and this is one thing, when I went to grad school, I thought I'd be talking about truth and beauty all the time. I had no idea I would learn about the building trades or some of the other things I've learned about along the way. But plastering became defunct basically after the Second World War, about 10 or 15 years after the Second World War. Sheetrock, drywall was invented during World War I, but people thought it was low class and didn't want it in their homes. But during the war, labor shortages and material shortages, Second World War, labor and material shortages led to sheetrock becoming commonplace. And the Plasterers Union refused to install it because they thought it would put them out of work. So it became something done by the laborers or the carpenters unions, which meant that the plasterers were marginalized really soon. If you weren't doing fancy plaster work in a high-end building, you weren't working anymore. Whereas 10 years earlier, every single home and office was wood lath on the wall and then plaster. So this is a a trade, an identity that was killed off by technological change, and that was really fundamentally about like the built environment of the city. And there's great passages late in the novel where Frankie's driving around with his son talking about all the buildings he'd worked in and all the, he'd see himself in the labor he'd done there. And so choosing that particular, you could have written this character with any number of other trades as his primary one, but Granger knows his stuff and he went with plastering. So Bill Granger that's my general Chicago literary background. Next frame, Bill Granger's career. Once again, he fits into the Chicago literary tradition because he was first a journalist, as was Carl Sandburg, Theodore Dreiser, many, many other Chicago writers. Though his career was diverse, he wrote for the wire services, he wrote for several different newspapers in Chicago and elsewhere. He covered the Troubles in Belfast. He absolutely was part of, just as the plastering business declined, so too did print journalism. And he turns to writing novels after the Daily News shuts down, and he looking around saying, what am I going to do to make a living? He's married, he has a son. He has to support, just like Frankie Coolin has this obligation to a family. So he begins writing novels. And once again, I never met Bill, even though our paths probably crossed a few times at the Billy Goat without knowing it. But I have nothing but admiration for him as a strategist, let's put it that way. He knew looking at the world of literature, what sells. Genre fiction sells. Mysteries, espionage novels, actually the biggest category is romance. If you want to make a living as a novelist, the best thing you can do is have a recurring character who you will be able to write a novel a year for an audience that buys into that character, likes your style, and will keep buying it. So his November Man series of espionage novels, very successful, and oddly prescient. The first book came out, and the plot involved the Irish Republican Army killing a member of the British royal family on their yacht. And 6 months later, the IRA assassinated Lord Mountbatten on his yacht in the Irish Sea. And people thought that Granger had somehow had inside dope because he'd been in Belfast doing this stuff. And of course he didn't. Another one of the novels had the US invading a small Caribbean country as sort of a diversion from a domestic political thing. And then Grenada happened during the Reagan years. One of the later novels was a terrorist was going to blow up the Zion nuclear power plant in order to basically make Chicago a nuclear wasteland. And when that came out, people wrote in the local papers like, oh my God, I hope he's not right again. And they actually upped the security at Zion because they were worried that he's shown us what we could see. He also wrote a number of crime novels, often under the pseudonym Joe Gash. The L murders, newspaper murders, Priestley murders. These are police procedurals where, as a reporter, he had gotten to know lots of cops, lots of people involved in the justice system. And they're pretty damn good books. My father introduced me to them when I was a teenager or a young man. And my father was a cop, and he thought that Granger really nailed the reality of how it worked, like what a heater case was. A murder is bad enough, but when it's a murder of a particular kind of victim in a particular kind of circumstance, the newspapers will get on you and the politicians will get on you because the newspapers are on them, and things will blow up in ways that aren't necessarily conducive to good police work or justice or abstract ideals. And what's interesting to me for looking at Granger as a writer of this kind is that I think it's probably one reason why this book wasn't taken as seriously as it might have been, because he was associated with genre writing. That's why the first edition, he published it under a pseudonym, Bill Griffith. Although I love this cover of Vice with the pickup truck that Frankie drives being squeezed, right? This distinction, I believe personally, and in a scholarly way too, between genre fiction and serious fiction is specious. The way it works out in our broader culture, though, is that in genre fiction, we expect a certain kind of plot. Think about it. Your murder mystery is a whodunit. Your romance is a bodice ripper. You want, cloak and dagger for your spy novels. Serious fiction, we read for deep, meaningful ideas about the world. Well, of course, that's a false distinction. Plenty of serious fiction is very plot driven, and plenty of popular fiction has serious ideas about the world in it. I frankly think Sarah Paretsky should be considered one of Chicago's greatest novelists. Her V.I. Warshawski series speaks to everything that all great Chicago novelists speak to, but because it's a detective series, some people put it in this little box. I remember almost literally 20 years ago, adding Paretsky to my Chicago writers class and dropping Saul Bellow and getting no end of grief for that. But I wanted to get a woman writer in there, and I wanted to get someone who was writing about labor unions. And so, yeah, Carrie's probably heard that story before. So I think though that experience, that genre thing, if you go to Granger on the internet and look at his like obituary and his Wikipedia page and stuff, there's like 25 novels. That's a serious output, but it's almost all these spy novels and mysteries. And this is the book that's held up as his one quote unquote serious, realistic novel. He also wrote a book about Jane Byrne with his wife Lori, and there's a collection of his columns from the Tribune published in a book called Chicago Pieces. All of these are out of print and used bookstore treasure hunting for you to look forward to. There's some available on eBay and Amazon of all these things. But I really think the time for Frankie Coolin, so let me finish the biography. Granger kept making his living as a novelist and a writer, and then he had a series of strokes in the late 90s and early aughts. The most tragic outcome I can imagine for a writer, which is he basically had aphasia. He lost the ability to read or write or speak, and spent the last decade or so of his life in a home for veterans because he'd served in the Army for 2 years. Very, very sad. Very, very sad ending for a writer. And he was like not around long enough that people sort of forgot him. When he passed, there was some acknowledgement of it, but I think his canonical status is in part due to this, just kind of all this output, and then it just stops. But it doesn't stop for the usual reason of someone dying. It's just not, he's not there. But I think Time for Frankie Coolin, one of the things that makes it a great book is because he had so much experience writing really tightly plotted spy and crime novels, when he decides to take on the question of space and values and place and write his Chicago book, he's able to put it into a form that makes for really compelling reading. And again, acknowledging that maybe not everybody's read it all, but the opening scene where two FBI agents brace Frankie and are trying to get him to like talk to them about something he knows nothing about and doesn't want to talk about, and the resistance, but are they going to come for him? Actually, contemporary political events, and I should do a little bracket here. I will be expressing opinions. Any opinion I express is mine and mine alone, and does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Hyde Park Historical Society, the University of Chicago Press, or Major League Baseball. So watching what's going on right now with the feds turning the screws on a certain individual currently residing in Florida, this sense of when the G wants you, they got you, and the sort of inevitability of federal law enforcement being relentless and being tireless and being really accurate, and give it up. And by the way, this is something that if you're a Chicago newspaper reader to this day, you see it all the time. I mean, I almost got to be on a jury for a big drug case, but my class would have interfered with it and they let me off. I kind of would have liked to have been there, but the feds win like 99.5% of the cases that go to trial, and only like 5% go to trial because people settle because they know they're done. So that would be common knowledge in the world Frankie Coolin moved in. A world that frankly includes a little bit of common criminality, right? You buy buckets of paint that fell off the back of a truck, or somebody gives you a couple of sides of beef and says, bring them to this restaurant, and don't ask any questions, and you get hijacked. I mean, there's a world of sort of casual, yeah, I didn't pay my taxes, or this is a cash deal, so I don't tell the G, that kind of world. Those people know that if the FBI comes calling, you're done. It's serious. So there's this sense, this plot throughout the book. But to stake my claim with a few generalities, and then maybe I'll read a couple of passages I think are most important, and then we'll start the discussion. I think this book is absolutely essential to the Chicago literary tradition because it depicts a transformative period in Chicago history from a point of view that we usually don't get. Generally, when we're looking at the transformation of desegregation after Hansberry versus Lee, after the Supreme Court decision that made real estate covenants illegal, generally we read Raisin in the Sun. And we look at it from the point of view of the African-American middle class people who want to get out of the ghetto, move to a nice house in a nice neighborhood. And by the way, I don't know how many of you are Steppenwolf subscribers, but the production several years ago at Steppenwolf of Clybourne Park, which is Bruce Norris's answer to Raisin in the Sun, a 2-act play where the first act, those of you who don't remember, because I know everyone knows the play, one character, the only white character in Raisin in the Sun is a representative of the like neighborhood association where they're going to buy the house, coming and saying, look, we'll buy it from you. Nothing personal, but you know, everyone should live with their own kind. You're happier that way. And they tell them to screw off. And the first act of Clybourne Park is that guy going back to the neighborhood and saying, we're done. They're not going to take the money. What happens next? The second act of Clybourne Park is 50 years later, and a white family is buying the house in the black neighborhood and gentrifying it. It's an absolute work of genius. But we're used to looking at this particular drama of race, and I don't mean this in a critical way, I mean, it's a good way. It's like we're looking at this from the point of view of the people who were marginalized and denied equality, and they're fighting for equality, and they're fighting to be central. This book is the flip side of that, because it depicts white racism and white ethnic prejudice, which are basically the same thing, although only one is the big thing. The book is, and there's a little, for those of you who didn't get to it yet, there's a little aside at the beginning. Common ethnic names, real street names, real neighborhoods, real suburbs, all are used in the story that follows. But despite the edge of realism, the story of Frankie Coolin and his time is fiction, and it's not intended to bear any resemblance to that of any person living or dead. Yeah, okay, sure, whatever. Point being, he's writing about people who fled to the suburbs because they didn't want to live with Black people. And once they're in the suburbs and Black people are going to be socializing with their children because the world has changed, they sit on bar stools and spout racism because that's who they are. That's where they're from. That's where they came up with. I always like to point out, whenever dealing with a text that depicts this kind of thing, that we need to keep in mind, like, okay, I'll use an example that's often brought up. Is The Sun Also Rises anti-Semitic? Because the character who's most often sort of marginalized and screwed with is the Jewish character Robert Cohn. I think the book depicts anti-Semitism. Description versus prescription. It only prescribes it. It doesn't say it's a good thing. Same thing with this novel. I think this novel depicts racism in all of its ugliness. And a character with a main character who arguably, and we'll get to this, I hope, you know, for those who've read the book, maybe he's racist, but maybe he's not. Or what do we mean by racist exactly? And when we get to that, I will cite Eve Ewing's great metaphor for thinking about racism, not as something that's in your heart, but something that's a social system that you have to deal with one way or the other. So this book is a book of white ethnic identity. It's a book that is in direct line with Farrell again. Those of you who might be James T. Farrell fans, great story called Fastest Runner on 61st Street that depicts a young kid, like a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old boy who's Polish and is constantly being derided as a dirty Polak. And he figures out there's a word that's worse than Polak. And if he calls people that word and beats those people up, that'll make him white. This book is in direct line with that story, because this is a book about fear of the other. It's a book about exploitation of the other, but also having to live with the other in ways that were unimaginable probably in Farrell's time. So that's my first argument for this book's value. Second argument is just, I think it's really well written. Occasionally people talk in paragraphs a bit much, but I come from a family where if you let someone get started, they might talk in a paragraph and you might have to listen to the whole thing. So there's moments when, Frankie or Frankie's brother John is on a bar stool spouting, and it is a paragraph, but read it aloud and you can hear it. The dialogue is snap, crackle, pop. The plot is tight and compelling and draws you along. the characterizations are fascinating. And again, it's third person, limited point of view, mostly with Frankie, but you get to know his father, you get to know his wife, you get to know his kids, you get to know his cousins, the people he has to deal with every day. And Emo, the Bohemian, the bartender, you get to know all these people, and they're real people. And maybe this is my own prejudice and background speaking, but I recognize the world I come from in these people and the places they live in and the values that are associated with them. From Emo, the Bohemian's happy hour bar with the old style sign on Butterfield Road, that could be 1,000 different old style bars in Chicago and the suburbs. The workplace, the rhythm of the life, you know, and again, we're just rereading it over the weekend. The Sunday Bears game is like the biggest event of the week for these guys, right? So that is the plot, the prose, the writing is just, in my mind, absolutely outstanding. Maybe though the most important thing, and here this will be a line that is both football and something bigger. When Frankie is talking with his son-in-law, Andy, the Polak, because of course everyone is identified by their ethnicity. No one is just a human. You're where you're from. And they're talking about work. And he says, work isn't everything. And Frankie replies, he says, work isn't everything, Mick said. This is Frankie's son. It's the only thing. If you ain't got work, you ain't got nothing else. Just like winning isn't the only everything, it's the only thing. One of the real through lines in Chicago literary history that I don't think has been fully unpacked is the importance of work. I mentioned it a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, hog butcher for the world, that's a job. Soulless toolmaker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, the nation's freight handler. Those are all manual labor, and the personification of Chicago as a young industrial worker is like at the root of our literature. And, you know, Theodore Dreiser, Sister Carrie, it's about the jobs. Sister Carrie has a factory job where she's sexually harassed. That's one reason why she's happy to take up with Jouet, the romantic traveling salesman, who will keep her, right, even out of wedlock. And then Hurstwood, the bar manager who falls for her, his sort of social status and his job is a huge part of his character. And if you look at, again, just some of the other novels I've already mentioned, Man with Golden Arm, Frankie Machine is the dealer, because that's his job. That's what makes him who he is. In Native Son, Bigger Thomas's first day on the job as a chauffeur for the Daltons goes terribly wrong, but he is defined by trying to get a job, trying to be something. And I've already mentioned Studs Lonigan and his plasterer role. But there is so much in this book about what work means, what work does to you physically, what work does to you emotionally, and how you have to hustle to get by. Frankie's desire that his son Mick will go to law school, even if it means for now he's got 3 more years of tuition to pay. So he will get out of that world of hustling in the trades and make something of himself. While at the same time, the book depicts the value, the pride, even if it's pride in, you know, being a jerk and doing things that are, you know, from an objective perspective, not great, like taking out the furnaces and the radiators. So the people you rent to have to pay electricity for space heaters because you don't want to pay the gas company. It's still labor, it's still work, it's still this physical stuff. I see we've got where's my watch? We got about a little more than 20 minutes left. I think I should stop there. I take it back. I'm going to do one key passage I think is important. And then I just want to open the floor to questions and to comments. And the passage I've chosen, it's on, if you got the book with you, 35 to 36. And for me, I mentioned it in the introduction, but you might not have read that. For me, this is a passage that absolutely nails the moment in Chicago's history that Granger is interested in. This moment where the west side and the south side has become almost entirely black and the white fighters have moved to the burbs, but things aren't settled yet. So he's leaving the bar, the Bohemians bar. And just above this, the Bohemians place was on a block of homes, an existing zoning variance from the days when the suburbs had been nearly rural. So probably not that long ago, probably 15, 20 years earlier. Slowly, he pulled out of the lot onto the shoulder of Butterfield Road. He waited for a break in the traffic and then moved into the narrow and busy artery, headed west for Hillside, through the town, under the expressway viaducts into DuPage County. Coolin had come here from the west side of the city long before, when the blacks swept through the old neighborhoods block by block after the Second World War. The west suburbs had grown up in a hurry after the war, and they were visual extensions of the sprawl of Chicago now. It was quitting time in a dozen factories that lined Manheim and Wolf Roads, and cars from the factories streamed into the old, narrow suburban roadways that had been built for rural traffic. Overhead in the darkening sky, minute by minute in relentless march, planes from O'Hare Field boomed above the rooftops. What I love about that passage is the way it captures the fact that what's happened to Frankie Coolin, what he's a participant in, as well as something that happened to him, is a world economic shift. Rural suburbs are becoming industrialized, but the roads are still narrow because they haven't been built up for the traffic they now have. And as you drive under expressway viaducts, those expressways that enabled white flight, and that were theoretically supposed to go around cities rather than through the middle of them, but Mayor Daley and a few other people took care of that. And above you in the sky are the planes of international globalized capitalism, booming into O'Hare. And a lot of O'Hare traffic is not passenger traffic, it's freight traffic. Just ask the entire village of Elk Grove Village. That is their economic reason for being. So to capture that image so gracefully, it's something that is also an advancement of the plot. Frankie's leaving the bar, he's driving to meet up with his nemesis, his wife's cousin, Pat Kennedy, who's the guy who's getting in all this trouble. And it's just part of the plot, but that part of the plot is this larger symbolic story of the values of Chicago and its suburbs and the world changing under the feet and over the head of Frankie Coolin. And that's what I love about this book, is that it does this kind of thing over and over again. Moments that are germane to plot and expressive of character are also about bigger issues, because Granger's that kind of thinker and writer. All right, so to leave plenty of time for a Q&A, I'll pause there and we can start a conversation. I've got other passages that I think are important that I will bring up as they fit in with what people want to talk about. But let's open the floor. Dottie, and I'm sorry, it says Hyde Park Historical Society, and I'm blanking on your name because I'm a terrible person.
It's Michael.
Who's Michael? Let's roll. Well, how do people want to handle this? It can go into the chat. It can be just verbal. Unmute yourself, raise your hand, whatever you want to do.
Well, Dottie, do we have anything in chat right now?
Not yet. So
Kathy Huff. I will call on people. I'll pretend I'm in charge.
yes.
Hi, Bill. I've been a fan of Bill Granger, the journalist. I'm learning through you and the Hyde Park Historical Society that he was also a novelist, which is great. I invited his widow to come to this book club meeting, Lorraine Granger, but she's out of the country right now. She's vacationing in France.
Well,
so
she can get into the tape.
She could really make some comments about Bill, you know, because you said you didn't meet him. But I remember in his columns, he would refer to his wife not by name. It was sort of like as a pronoun, you know,
Herself.
yeah. You know, so it was characteristic of what you're saying, that he was as a writer. He carried that over from being a journalist.
Yep.
And indeed, they lived in Hillside, Illinois, until he had the stroke. And I know Lori, who's very interesting, she's a retired attorney, was active in politics as well.
Oh, their book about Jane Byrne is great.
Yes, about Bernie.
Fighting Jane.
Yes, so I think that's an interesting little bit of backdrop. She and I were in the same class at Antioch College. That's how I met her, and she still lives in Chicago on the go.
Small world
department.
Yeah, but one of the things that I think you can, so pointing out, just Kathy, to elaborate a little bit on what you just said, one of the strengths of the book comes from his background as a journalist, that getting all over town, like the job of a journalist back in the day, now it's very different because of what's happening. But his job was to like go around town and talk to people and go places and see things and eat food and have a drink and be part of the city and its movement. The only comparable person right now is probably Neil Steinberg. And he says, I remember he would say whenever he would encounter, there would be a story about some journalist plagiarizing stuff. He's like, why would you do that? There's so much interesting stuff to write about. Go out there and find it. Why make stuff up? The world is more interesting than that. And I think Granger brought that attitude. And he did a lot of the sort of neighborhood columns, like, you know, stories about, you know, a building being torn down that everybody liked, or a business closing and leaving a block empty, or somebody moving in and trying to start something new. I mean, that kind of block by block level. But he also could pull back like the planes over O'Hare and see the big picture.
So you're saying he didn't really have to do a lot of research. He already had done the homework.
I think he lived this book.
He lives the book, yeah.
He knew guys like this. And he was a, you know, like Royko and many other Chicago journalists, he was a bar guy. He liked going out to bars. And so you sit in those bars long enough, like the description of the Bohemians right at the beginning of the novel. Where is it here? Sorry, it was 4 p.m. and they were sitting in the middle of the bar, which was rapidly filling with customers. Most of the men, and they were all men, were dressed like Frankie in flannel shirts and Levi's and steel-toed boots. Their eyes looked tired and bloodshot, and their faces were colored red by sun and wind. The bar was not very dark. It smelled of stale beer and stale cigarette smoke. The once white ceiling panels were stained yellow like teeth. The black plastic paneling was greasy to the touch. Behind the bar, along its length, a dark and dusty mirror reflected their faces as they drank beer. That's 1,000 neighborhood bars in Chicago and the suburbs. And he knew it. Other comments, questions?
You left, I have one.
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry. There is a question. Chester, I'll get back to that, but whoever was just talking.
Me?
No.
Okay.
Ruth,
Sorry.
and then I'll get to Chester.
I was reminded of Betty Howland, who only wrote 3 books, or published 3 books, but she's talking about those people that you're looking for. So you didn't mention that. I don't know if you.
Well, Betty Howland, she would be another person I would put in the neglect category. And
yeah,
Carrie, you can back me up on this. You wrote a great piece about her for the Core magazine. But I would say she comes from a very different angle. She's much more part of the Saul Bellow U of C coterie than the journalistic angle. But I think Blue Chicago is a great book. And I think somebody's bringing it back in print.
Oh, it had recently.
Yes,
Yeah, recently
it's been republished. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I scored a first edition at the Newbury Library Book Fair.
Good.
Oh.
You mentioned Core magazine. What's that?
It's the magazine for U of C alumni.
Core?
I believe so. Carrie, can you back me up? Am I wrong?
Oh, anyway, I get it.
It's college alumni, yeah. The Betty Howland piece was actually in the main alumni magazine.
Okay.
So different alumni magazines. So Chester, I found it interesting that Frankie referred to Muslims as towel heads. I was not aware there were many Muslims at the time that this book was written. Well, 1 billion or so, but not in Chicago. So one of the things that makes the book, again, about the bigger world rather than just this one dude, is all the talk, for instance, of the gas crisis and how gas prices went up because of the towel heads, the Arabs. This is the 70s. This is the OPEC shutdown. This is with inflation now. And Saudi Arabia is building giant refineries, which Frankie's son-in-law, against his wife's wishes, is probably going to go spend 6 months working at to get ahead. But that disparaging term, there were probably maybe 25% as many Arab immigrants in Chicago, or Muslim Islamic immigrants in Chicago when this book is written in the 70s as there are now in the 2020s. But the politics of the world was still part of the politics of Chicago. And so you're going to have a disparaging term for everybody. And so those towel heads in Saudi Arabia are why your gas prices are so high for your pickup truck. You can type stuff in, you can talk.
Yeah.
Here to talk. Dottie?
I just thought on page 94, when John Coolin is talking, he said, I think these federal guys aren't playing. In fact, I think they got you by the nuts is what I think. They were asking after me about you and your big deals and your property. They wanted to know if you had a joint in Wisconsin. They were asking if you had some buildings and a trust. Listen, when they start nickel and diming you that way, they are after your ass.
That's the way they get the big guys.
Yeah, but his language is just terrific.
Yeah, I mean, and it's again, the federal thing. And this is also, he's the same guy who, goes on at length about his racist beliefs that Black people shouldn't be anywhere near. If one walks through the door of his house, that's the last time that'll ever happen. This kind of thing. One of the plot points, not to blow it all for anybody, is, Frankie's a tough guy, right? Hardworking, but he can't talk to anybody about this stuff because he's afraid if he tells anybody, the facade will crack, and he doesn't want to tell his wife because she'll worry, and he doesn't want to make her worry. He doesn't want to tell anybody, but because the FBI is going around questioning people, all the people around him know something's going on, but he just does this stoic, head in the sand, straightforward, tough guy thing. And I think some of the most moving passages in the book are Granger talking about how he really does love his wife, even if he thinks she's living in a fantasy world of genteel middle-class America when they're not. That doesn't really exist. But he really does love her, and he doesn't want to hurt her or worry her. And he's afraid if he goes to jail, like, what's going to happen to his kids? It's like he said, I can do the time, but what's going to happen to everybody else? So there's this, the flip side of the guy who never puts any money on the bar and lets everybody else buy him beers is he's so terrified what this will do to his family. And that kind of tension is built into this drama of white flight, right? The people leaving the neighborhood because they're moving in and it won't be safe for us anymore. Just a little bit of the backstory that I won't blow any plot points. Frankie's dad, who is now in his 80s and blind and lives in the basement, sort of haunts the place like the spirit of the Irish immigrant worker. And when it was finally time to sell his home on the west side, he'd worked for the streetcars and he sold it to a Black CTA conductor. And they bonded over the fact that public transportation has gone downhill. Imagine what they'd say now, right? But that's a really insightful thing about people who otherwise might be at each other's throats or hate each other, but have something in common, and it's about work. They both work the same kind of job, so they can talk about their work together. And that's a way, that's a way I would always argue to transcend these other forms of division and identity. And there's another moment when Woyobo, the Black dude who kind of helps Frankie manage his properties, he thinks Frankie's going away. He's like, I've got a plan that'll save you. This is how we're going to work it. And there's this moment where they look at each other and each of them knows, I'd do that if I was in the other guy's shoes. The sense of being the same, despite these differences that otherwise they both throw back and forth at each other with the racist language and the dismissals and the bristling. This is also a sort of a toxic masculinity book, right? If you want to learn how to be a tough guy, which is not something I recommend, this is a book you could learn in it.
One thing that I thought, in addition to his insecurity about, the FBI for so persistently, or the government people being after him and following him and being in the background.
Right.
Frankie was economically insecure because his profession had left and he never knew where his next job was going to come from.
Right.
But he always seemed hopeful that he could still manage and get something because he was strong and he could use it back and do manual labor if he had to, and he could still make a living and support his family and his wife, even if. And he did achieve a lot. He bought these old buildings, maybe.
No, he said he's very explicit. He buys them for nothing at the tax sales.
Yeah.
So think about that, Joseph. This is a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up. Did you have more? I didn't want to cut you off.
Well, it reminds me I have a 2-car garage, so I have one car, so I run half of it.
Right,
And,
exactly.
and one day, the guy who's a man, an African-American who lives down the street a block away, parks a $125,000 Mercedes in the garage. This guy is not too well educated, but how did he do it? So he tells me he owns 4 apartment buildings. He started out, and I'm sure did all the manual labor and the upkeep and the paperwork and everything, and little by little saved money and and created this for himself. And for reasons of his own or his wife's interest, they decided to display their ability by buying this big car.
Driving a Bentley. Well,
But
no,
in a way, he's the nicest guy in the world. We have very nice chats every once in a while.
but he also doesn't want to park his car on the street. He wants it
That's
in the
right.
garage.
That's
Let
right.
me just point out again how this kind of literary representation of the city, how complex it can be. So Frankie's buying buildings at tax auction, which means the prior owner has abandoned it and has not paid the taxes. The prior owner abandoned it. The prior owner might have built it. And this, again, is something you can see back in Farrell. I mean, this white flight stuff starts in the 20s. You know, the Washington Park Irish had fled from farther north on the south side out to Washington Park before they fled there out to Oak Lawn. So these buildings would have been abandoned because their owners wouldn't live in the neighborhood with these other people. Frankie comes in, buys them for nothing, does the manual labor to make it affordable for him to rent to people who can or do or must live in that neighborhood. So it's about the literal physical space going on. And that's like his baseline income. Like he's got 3 buildings, he's bought a 4th, the 4th, the one that Plot Point burns down late in the novel. So if he keeps those buildings occupied and he doesn't have any trouble, and his black, employee, whatever crony helps him keep the lid on things, that's his monthly, that he'll make it through the year. But that's not enough. He's got tuition to pay for the kids. He's got one kid who's still in high school. She's going to go to college, Catholic schools. So he's always looking for more. He's doing the side jobs, the plastering for this old lady. Because of course, an old lady with a nice bungalow is going to want plaster repairs done, right? But he's looking for an inside job for winter. So condo conversion in downtown factories, we think of that as like very modern, but that starts back in the 80s. And if he can get one of those jobs, get you through the winter. Meanwhile, he's still got the buildings. He's still doing that work. He's still, it's this constant. And if he doesn't get a winter indoor job, maybe he's, doing stuff outside that isn't so pleasant. But yeah, this constant hustle, but it's a hustle that's about literally building and maintaining the city. And again, I can't recommend highly enough the scenes near the end when he's driving around with Mick and just thinking about all these buildings that I was in all these buildings. I built this place, right? That sense of connection. Frankly, the only thing I can parallel to is Roddy Doyle's Dublin novels. His trilogy, The Commitments, The Snapper, and The Van. In the second one, the father's unemployed, and he'd also been a plasterer and a painter. And he would walk around Dublin and think, I did that building, I did that building, I did that building. And that working class connection to the place, as opposed to I financed the sale of that building and I represented that guy in court or whatever. This, like, we got to live in something. And these are the guys who build it.
I would like to say
something, please.
Here. For a couple of points. One is this story is very near to where I grew up, which was a suburb called Elmhurst, which is just a couple towns over from Hillside. I knew Hillside very well growing up in the late 60s and early 70s. So I was pretty familiar with that area. One thing that wasn't clear to me in the book, but certainly I'm very familiar with, was the fact that the distance between Hillside and the west side is less than 10 minutes on the Eisenhower Expressway.
Right.
It wasn't that much of a white flight, and yet the neighborhoods were so drastically different.
Right. Well, it's not about how far it is. It's about who lives there.
Exactly.
Tom McNamee is another great Chicago journalist. He's been an editor at the Sun-Times now for many years. I don't think he writes anything directly anymore. But many years ago, I clipped a column he wrote about Farrell, where he described growing up on the South Side and Marquette Park, basically. And he's like, you never saw any black people west of Halstead until you did. And you never saw any black people west of Racine until you did. You never saw any black people west of Ashland until you did. And then you never saw any black people west of Western until you did. And then the neighborhood up and moved. And like they flicked the lights and turned off, put up the bar stools at the end of the shift. So it was a process of transformation that some neighborhoods resisted. Beverly, Scott Smith has a great essay in Rust's Chicago neighborhood collection about how to integrate a neighborhood in the midst of white flight. But like, think about Oak Park versus Austin. You cross the street and it's a different world. Property values, city services, everything. So yeah, it's not that far. And he expresses that. He says, you know, the sprawl of the suburbs was identical to the city by this point. Because those parts of the city that were farther west were also getting the mid-century modernist bungalows and stuff, like you can picture Frankie living in.
So, Bill, we have a
And-
question. Oh, go ahead.
I see the question there. Is there parallels
Michael-
from the
Michael,
Hispanic
it's
takeover of
finished.
drywall installation trades, unionized or otherwise? Not that I know of. And again, the novels of immigration, the Latinx novels of immigration that I'm familiar with are all by women. It's the House on Mango Street, it's Ana Castillo, it's Achia Bejas. I've yet to see like a really solid representation of working class Mexican literature from a male author. But it's
Michael, I don't
only
think
a
you're-
coincidence that the laborers trades where they would do that are now dominated by Mexican immigrants. 40 years ago, they were dominated by Eastern European immigrants. 40 years before that, they were dominated by Irish immigrants, because it's always the immigrants, strong back, maybe no language skills, that get into those jobs. But yeah, you were going to say something else?
Michael, you were going to say something else?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the other aspect of this, aside from the proximity of Hillside to the west side, which was really, as I said, 10 minutes away and
Yeah.
still is,
Sure.
was the difference between the suburbs or among the suburbs. I grew up in Elmhurst, which is less than 5 minutes away from Hillside. And yet Hillside was entirely blue collar and Elmhurst was entirely white collar. And I never knew anybody like Frankie Coolin in my young life in Elmhurst, because I lived on a street where the guy across the street was the banker. The guy next to him was the principal of the local high school.
Sure.
The guy next to us was a realtor. Nobody in the trades.
That's
And
because
yeah,
that's because we think of suburbs versus the city as one thing when it's really suburbs replicate city neighborhoods. Just
exactly,
like there are neighborhoods in Chicago where you don't have a lot of tradesmen, there are suburbs where you don't have a lot of tradesmen. But the book also includes a really good anchor when there's a mention that Wrigley Field is in a bad neighborhood. Right now, back in the 70s, you could have bought one of the two flats across from Wrigley for $20,000.
Wow.
I have friends who didn't and regret it to this day. But East Lakeview was a slum. Now it's gentrified.
As was Old Town. Old
Right.
Town in the 60s,
Yeah,
you were
Reed-
afraid to walk down there.
yeah.
I
Read.
mean, it was for hippies
Yeah.
and kids. Yeah.
If you're looking for a good book, Daniel K. Hertz's Battle of Lincoln Park recounts that transformation of Old Town and the South. Old Town is formerly in the Lincoln Park community area, so worth doing. Other questions? I've got a little more time. I know that 8:30 was kind of our endpoint, but if people have more things they want to say, I'm happy to keep chatting a little bit.
I found,
Oh,
go ahead, Bruce, go ahead.
I just don't, it's not really relevant, but I don't exactly agree with the Old Town characteristic from the 60s and the other place that you, where else did you say? Oh, East.
East Lakeview.
Yeah, East,
Well, if you-
even that, both, they were not, no, they were very often large parts well-to-do.
If you were far
Very
enough east,
well-to-do.
if you
I
were
was
far
not,
enough- if you were
but
far enough east in East Lakeview, yes. If you were right around Wrigley Field, there was light industry. There was still a rail yard with a coal running down the street. If you look at the crime statistics and the histories of that neighborhood, especially, it has been gentrified since. Now, was it the sort of ghetto we think of when we think
Right,
of the
might
South
be
and
a
West Side?
definition,
No.
yeah.
But there was an organization in Lincoln along Armitage Street, the Young Lords. You had Puerto Rican and African American working with the Black Panthers and with what the guy who wrote his autobiography called the Hillbilly Radicals. They were all part of the same radical movements. And one reason why Old Town got preserved is, and this is again in Daniel K. Hertz's book, artists moved in because they were being driven out of what became Sandburg Village, which is a story of public renewal done by private enterprise, or urban renewal, the city giving stuff to private developers to make money. But the people who bought these places wanted to fix them up. So there was the sort of hobohemia angle to that. But just read it. It's called The Battle of Lincoln Park. It's a great book. It's short. You read that, and then if you still disagree, The Battle of Lincoln Park by Daniel K.A.Y. Hertz,
Okay.
like to rent a car. All right, well, I won't pull any teeth. If anybody, if you have another question, you can always zap me an email. I'm easily found on Northwestern's website. Thank you so much. I was so happy to be able to talk about this book and to have a chance to reread it just for both
Well, it
fun.
was great to have you here.
Yeah,
And
I've only
thank you.
taught it once before, so now I
Oh,
know.
really? Wow.
Yeah, it's in a graduate course on urban transformation.
And Bill, I just have one last question.
Sure.
What triggered the reissuing of the book?
Oh, I've got it. I had it in my notes, and I'm sorry I didn't say it. So this book is back in print, and it
Yes.
sold so poorly it never went to paperback.
Oh,
It's
wow.
the book of his that probably sold the least.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but there was an editor at the University of Chicago Press named Maggie Hivner. I worked with her on, and my colleague David Schmickens on the annotated edition of Chicago City on the Make back in 2001. And she was always just on the prowl for neglected Chicago books.
Oh, interesting.
So she's like, what one Chicago book should be back in print if you could do it? And I'm like, time for Frankie Coolin. They
Wow.
contacted Lori Granger, got the rights. So this is the first paperback edition.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
Yeah, if you go looking for it online, you're only going to find hardcovers
yeah.
of the first. She's also the reason my George Ade book came out. She was like, Carrie can speak to this. I taught a class where the Newbury Library about Chicago saloon culture. Carrie calls it my drinking class. I call it my thinking about drinking class. The excerpts from that book were completely the hit of the class. I'm like, this book would probably be of interest to people in our sort of contemporary, cocktail culture, boomtown world. So that's an important thing because it's about individuals and institutions. Maggie Hivner worked at the University of Chicago Press for ages, and she did great work. And this book is in print because of her.
Wow.
Pardon me, but could you repeat when this will be in print again?
It's in print now.
Oh, now, okay.
Oh, yeah.
The first edition didn't sell enough to have a paperback.
And the first edition was 1982, and then
Right.
this is 2014.
And I mean, 1982 and, Random House,
Yeah.
top trade publisher.
Yeah.
It's not like he was, frankly, his Chicago Pieces book is a press that he and his wife created. November Press.
Right.
after
Yeah,
November.
Lori. And Lori's very self-effacing. You wouldn't know that she's done all this stuff, But they made an interesting couple, I'll say.
Well, like I said, I never met the man, but I always admired his work. And if I can do anything at all to keep his work out there for other people to admire,
Great.
my work is done. My work is done. See, it's all comes back to work.
Well, his columns were stellar, though.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a great Chicago writer.
Yeah. Well, this was a great evening.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for this.
Absolutely my
Thank
pleasure.
you, Bill.
And like I said, if anybody wants to shoot me any other questions, zap me an email. I probably won't look at it till tomorrow morning, but I'm
So what is your email?
b-savage@northwestern.edu.
And
Very
you
easy
might also want to follow Bill on Twitter.
if you're on Twitter,
If
at
you're on
Rogers
Twitter.
Parkman.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll give one more, I just want to read one more very brief bit that I
Yep.
thought was just great. So where is it here? So this is when Frank, late in the novel, Frankie's son is trying to convince him to bring him on and let him take care of the buildings if Frankie goes to jail. And they stop at a diner on Madison Street. And a regular waitress. "Who's the young guy?" she said. "Too young for you, Mayor," Frankie said. "Besides, guys don't know how to do anything till they get to be my age." Mary smiled. "This is my kid. This is my kid," Frankie said. "Your kid? Honest, I didn't think you were that old. I thought you were Frankie. I thought you were around 40. "I am," Frankie lied. "How old are you?" "How are you?" said Mary. Mick smiled through it all. "What'll it be? Breakfast for him. I want a bowl of chili." "I was telling him about the chili and I got hungry for it." "Best chili on the West Side," Mary said. "Which means it's the best in the world," Frankie Coolin said. "West Side is the best side." Across the counter, a couple of People's Gas workers looked up from their eggs and smiled at Frankie. "You got that right," one of them said. "2 chilies," Mick said. So this, another reason it's a great Chicago neglected classic, we don't have a lot of books about the West Side. And this is one.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, on that note, I'll sign off. I'm going to go get some chili. I'm feeling kind of hungry.
Yeah.
Thanks
so
again,
much.
Dottie.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mark.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Peace. Be
Great
safe
evening.
out there.
Night,
Great. Bye.
good night. Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Thanks.
Not great session.
It was really,
Just want to make one comment. I don't know, one of the last sessions we had with about the, the reporters that we did. Well, Dorothy Thompson in the Holocaust plays a prominent role in that film.
oh, in the Ken Burns film.
In
last night.
Ken Burns' Holocaust.
Yes, I mean, it was all that first, you're absolutely right, that first segment last night,
Last night.
it was Dorothy Thompson.
Yeah, quite a bit.
So, yes. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, interesting, because that was also a great book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our last month, so. Anyway, we try to keep you all engaged, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Yes.
Thank you.
And
Good to see everybody.
see you in October.
Yes.
Good night.
All right.